Never have I ever seen two people who call themselves parents want and hope that their child is found sick as much as these defendants have here throughout the course of this trial. Every cough, every vomit, every ailment that a child can have throughout the course of their childhood was documented and mattered after the fact. Because they have to explain how their 3-month-old, who can't walk, who can't talk, who can't crawl, who can't roll over, had 8 fractures to her body. 8 fractures when Emma was never dropped and never fell off of anything. Defendants had no problem taking their child to urgent care for constipation, for vomiting, for nicking the nail, the skin when they were trimming the nail.
Objection, Your Honor. It wasn't defendants who took their child to urgent care for the nicking of the nails. It was defects because it happened during a supervised visitation.
All right.
But
Thank you. Continue.
Thank you. But after they got caught, it mattered. What were they doing when Emma got bruises to her neck, her trunk, the diaper area from the car seat? What were they doing when she got bruising behind the ear? What were they doing when they saw that the child's scalp was swollen? What were they doing when they saw that one side of the child's face was swelling up? What were they doing when they saw that the child's leg was swollen? They didn't take her to urgent care. They waited. It only mattered when they realized that the doctors could see what they couldn't see, and they realized that. It only mattered when the doctors told them that they could see the history of what Emma's body had to endure. It mattered when they realized that none of the doctors, including Dr. Chanduri, Emma's pediatrician, weren't buying the story that Emma had a history of bruising from the car seat, bruising from holding her head while applying nasal spray, bruising from doing bicycles to pass gas and leaning in too hard. It mattered when they were facing criminal charges and were being watched. And now Emma, who up until this point had been healthy, growing, and thriving, according to Dr. Chanduri, who had seen her since birth, and now all of a sudden she's painted as this sickly child. Throughout the course of this trial, we've heard a kitchen sink of defenses in hopes that one of these will stick. From rickets, vitamin C deficiency, vitamin D deficiency, copper deficiency, osteogenesis imperfecta, the list just goes on. And I don't know what trial they were sitting in, but the state brought to you the people that you needed to hear from. No, we're not going to bring in an officer just to tell you, oh, we spoke to person A, B,
Your Honor,
and
I'm just
C.
going to go ahead and interpose an objection for purposes of the record that the state characterizing the defenses in this way is not accurate and not appropriate.
Okay, it's argument. You may proceed.
Thank you. No, we're not going to bring in an officer just to say, yes, we spoke to person A, B, and C, only to not be able to go into what A, B, and C said, because that's hearsay. We brought to you the people that they talked to so that you can hear for yourselves what they found and what they observed and what their findings were. We brought you the skeletal surveys. We brought you the medical records. We brought you the people that the defendant spoke to early on in the investigation in speaking with the defendants for their explanations of how these injuries happened. And no, we didn't call the pediatric orthopedic surgeon who put the splint on Emma because that was the extent of their involvement. They put a splint on Emma. Nurse Borders testified to that was the extent. But ladies and gentlemen, you can use your common sense. If the pediatric orthopedic surgeon didn't think there was anything wrong with Emma, they wouldn't have put a splint on her. Now, the defense has been painting Dr. Mesner, the child abuse pediatrician, as this evil character who's on a mission to mark every child with child abuse. But ladies and gentlemen, let me remind you who all suspected child abuse even before we got to Dr. Mesner. Emma's pediatrician, Dr. Chanduri, the ER doctor, Dr. Krieger, the social worker.
And Your Honor, again, she's mischaracterizing the evidence regarding these folks' testimony. I recognize it's closing and that there is wide latitude, but when she is mischaracterizing testimony from the ER doctor that only came back after the skeletal survey, then I would object.
Okay, objection overruled. Continue,
Thank you, Your Honor.
please.
Abby Rising, the social worker, radiologist, defects.
Your Honor, I'm
So
sorry, now,
radiologist.
Your Honor, I must object. At this point, is the argument from the state that the defects investigation is relevant and something that we can go into as evidence?
No, ma'am. No, ma'am.
Okay, I will make a continuing objection that we sought to introduce this evidence to the jury and we're.
Ma'am, I've asked not to go into this in front of the jury. Thank you.
Thank you, Your Honor.
You may continue.
The radiologist, and then we get to Dr. Mesner. All of those people, before it ever gets to Dr. Mesner, suspected child abuse before Dr. Mesner diagnosed Emma with non-accidental trauma. And then Dr. Wilcox, a geneticist, confirmed that he believes this is non-accidental trauma. Experts from within different departments all suspected child abuse, all say that this is child abuse. And yet the defendants would have you believe that this is genetics, that this is vitamin D deficiency. But ladies and gentlemen, if you recall the evidence was that her vitamin D level was low, but it was not so low that it affected her skeletal structure. It wasn't so low that it couldn't go up with multivitamins. It wasn't so low that it would cause fractures from normal handling. Now, the defense stating that the vitamin D deficiency happened in utero, we heard testimony from Dr. Wilcox that babies take from their mother. So even if there was a vitamin D deficiency on the part of the mom, the baby's fine. It takes from the mom. If anything, it would affect the mom. And we heard testimony from the defendant herself that she fell during her pregnancy, and she was fine. There's nothing wrong with Emma's vitamin D other than the fact that it was just low. It did not affect her skeletal structure. So I want to go back. Also want to point out that vitamin D deficiency in and of itself does not cause people to spontaneously crack. Fractures are caused by some mechanism. It's a force great enough to break the bendy bone of a child. It's a force that cannot be generated by a 3-month-old who can't even roll over. It's a force greater than that which can be generated by a toddler. And that is malice. We'll talk about the labs. Now, even in Dr. Benson's own words, Emma was the most thoroughly tested infant that he's ever seen. And indeed, that is what the evidence showed. She had normal calcium levels. She had normal alkaline phosphatase levels. She had no blood clotting disorder. She had no blood disorder. She had no bone disorder. She had no kidney or liver disease. Everything turned out normal in her lab. She does not have a disorder. And we also talked extensively about the fractures because that is what they've been charged with. There was testimony that there were healing fractures, 3 rib fractures and 1 right foot fracture. There were also acute fractures, the 2 right femoral classic metaphyseal lesions, 1 right tibial classic metaphyseal lesion, and 1 left tibial classic metaphyseal lesion. And you heard testimony that rib fractures and classic metaphyseal lesions are highly specific for child abuse. This is not from the normal handling of a child. The fact that there were healing and acute fractures show that these happened at different points in time. The child was fractured not once, but on at least 2 different occasions. And I also want to point out that Dr. Benson, in his testimony, denied there ever being any sort of classic metaphyseal lesions. I do think it's curious that defense fails to bring up the testimony of Dr. Krishnamurthy and Dr. Hutchison. Dr. Hutchison, their own pediatric radiologist, admitted that she too saw rib fractures. She too saw at least 1 classic metaphyseal lesion. Again, it's up to you to determine the credibility of these witnesses. Bruises were brought up several times throughout the course of this trial. And the main purpose of it was to explain for why there were additional skeletal surveys done. Emma didn't have 4 skeletal surveys just because of this one incident. She went up on June 6th. She went in for the skeletal survey. As a follow-up, she went again in June. And then in July, there was a new incident happen. That's why Emma has more skeletal surveys than would normally occur on a child for one incident, because there was more than one incident that happened in this case. And what you heard during trial was that you could see from the skeletal surveys that there was further evidence of healing of the prior fractures. But there were no additional fractures once Emma was removed from the defendants. There was also no additional bruises once Emma was removed from family members. And we know that because despite the fact that the daycare center witness said that she saw bruising on the soles of the feet, she leaves out the photo of the squeeze marks. She denies that she saw those when she saw Emma. She only identifies the photographs of the bottoms of the feet. She does not acknowledge the squeeze mark photographs. We also heard testimony from one of defense's witnesses that they took photos of bruisings that she saw, but she never gave them to the defense. And we don't see them here today either. And ladies and gentlemen, defense has brought up acrocyanosis multiple times. And I think you can also use your common sense. Anyone who's had a child knows what acrocyanosis looks like. But we've also heard testimony on what acrocyanosis is. We've heard testimony from one of the foster parents, Mr. Irvin, of what acrocyanosis looks like. It's when the child has a temperature change, can't adjust, looks blue, and that warms up very quickly. It does not last for days like bruises does. We also heard a lot about genetics. Her COL1A1 was tested. There was no abnormality. COL1A2, there was no abnormality. We heard from Dr. Wilcox that there was no disorder predisposing her to fractures. There was no evidence for rickets. There was no evidence for Bethel-myopathy. There was no evidence for hypermobile Ehlers-Danlos. She doesn't have cystic fibrosis. Now, we heard a lot about variants, genetic variants, but again, it's been stated by both Dr. Wilcox and their own geneticist. Just because you have a variant does not mean the child has a genetic disorder. It has to manifest. It has to present. It has to show. And this child, Emma, did not have any of that. Now, Dr. Krishnamurthy said decades down the line she may, but she didn't have it on June 6th or prior to that point. The child does not have a genetic disorder. And again, credibility is for you to decide. Now, they attacked the CHOA doctors, they've attacked DFACS workers. Ladies and gentlemen, CHOA doesn't go knocking on doors trying to take people's babies away. They have a duty. They have a job to do. They are mandated reporters. In a sense, it's no different than if a teacher were to see bruises on a child and they report to DFACS because they are mandated reporters. For these doctors, they can read skeletal surveys and they see what is equivalent to a layperson seeing something on the outside. They saw signs of child abuse. That is why they reported it. What motive do they have to make this up? To have this vendetta against this family? They're just doing their job. And they came here and testified because they received a subpoena to do so. And the same is true with DFACS. They weren't.
Your Honor, I would object to any mention of the DFACS investigation since it has, of course, been ruled irrelevant.
Are you addressing the testimony presented by DFACS?
Talking about testimony that was presented by the workers.
Right, okay, I'm gonna allow it, go ahead.
And Your Honor, I would make a continuing objection because we were not allowed to present testimony from DFACS workers.
She'll only be allowed to argue and comment on the testimony that was here in the courtroom.
Just want to make sure the record is complete, Your Honor.
Yes, ma'am, thank you.
And the same is true with DFACS. They didn't just randomly take these people's children away. They heard the reports of the doctors. they spoke to the defendants, something didn't match. In order to protect the child was removed from the home. And the defendants testified. Ladies and gentlemen, the defendants have every reason to lie. They are the ones sitting in trial. They are the ones that are facing these charges. So whether or not you believe what they say is up to you. But I would say that that is something that you can consider when judging their credibility. The same applies to their friends. Now, there's been a lot of testimony about their good character, but ladies and gentlemen, people usually don't abuse their child in front of other people. There's a reason why these cases are hard. It's because it happens behind closed doors. And especially when it happens to a child who can't talk, that is when we do have to rely on the medical evidence. Because what other way is there to protect this child? Defense's experts. And again, I do think it's curious that they left out Dr. Krishnamurthy and Dr. Hutchison. Dr. Krishnamurthy, she was a very sweet lady. She couldn't testify to a whole lot other than that she was very curious about a lot of these genetic variants. A lot was unknown. But she admitted that nothing was presenting in Emma. And really, between all of defense's experts, she was the only person that's actually had contact with Emma, that's actually laid eyes on Emma. And she did not see any genetic disorders present on Emma at the time. Dr. Hutchison. Dr. Hutchison, who is a pediatric radiologist, who's had a lot of experience working at children's hospitals and currently works in private practice, who was essentially a hired expert, even she could not say that these fractures weren't there. She can see the fractures. She can see the rib fracture. She can see the classic metaphyseal lesion. There were fractures on Emma. And she also testified that there was absolutely no evidence that Emma had rickets. There was no evidence that there was anything wrong with her bone density. All she could say was vitamin D can affect bone health. But there's no evidence that it did. And for Dr. Benson, I would like to point out that he seems to contradict all the doctors, really. And if you recall his testimony, he was tendered as an expert in a very specific area, and yet he seemed to have a wide gamut of knowledge in all these other things. He was suddenly knowledgeable in OBGYN, he was knowledgeable in dentistry, he was knowledgeable in genetics, he just knows everything. And ladies and gentlemen, I would ask that you compare what his testimony was with even the defense's own experts. Ladies and gentlemen, defense wants you to feel bad for this couple. They have
Your Honor,
attempted to
we are
use
not
sympathy.
seeking, the court will of course instruct them that sympathy is not a favor, and so
Yes,
the
ma'am.
process of seeking that is wrong.
I will give that instruction, yes, ma'am.
Thank you, Your Honor.
They have attempted to use sympathy to get you to forget what the actual facts in this case are. They've tried to distract you with completely, utterly irrelevant evidence. But ladies and gentlemen, these defendants both played a role in this. They were both the only two caretakers for Emma. They were the only individuals with sole access to Emma in their home in Forsyth County when her bones were broken. And her bones were in different stages of healing, meaning that it happened more than once. And ladies and gentlemen, I submit to you that the defendant's presenting photo of the ear bruising and listing possibilities of what they think happened, it wasn't being cooperative or forthcoming. They knew what happened to Emma. They probably got scared that what happened to her this time was a little too much, and they took her to the doctor. And then they came up with excuses to cover their tracks. And when the doctors and DFACS didn't find the excuses plausible, they came up with more. And that's what they tried to do throughout the course of this trial, in hopes that something will stick. Ladies and gentlemen, it's not a coincidence that after the child was removed from the defendants, the child no longer had fractures. Sometimes the simplest explanation is usually the correct one. And in this case, it's because this is child abuse. This was aggravated battery family violence. This was cruelty to children in the first degree. They were the only two caretakers, the only individuals with access to this child when her bones were broken. That is child abuse. Abuse of the most innocent of all human beings. A child who can't talk, who can't roll over. Dr. Chanduri did her duty. Dr. Krieger did her duty. Dr. Mahalan Ray did her duty. Dr. Lynham did her duty. Abby Rising, the social worker, did her duty. DFACS did their duty. Dr. Mesner did his duty. Dr. Chang did his duty. Dr. Wilcox did his duty. Everyone did their part to protect Emma. And now it's your turn.